This day and time. What happened today, years ago?
The first one, it takes us to the Philippines.
Right, Southeast Asia. The first moment the source really zooms in on is the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, June 15th, 1991. This volcano, it just erupted massively after being quiet for, 600 years?
And the description of the scale is just huge. Billions of tons of ash shooting like 35 kilometers high.
Yeah, staggering numbers. And it wasn't just a local problem either. The article makes a point that this ash spread globally. It literally wrapped around the Earth. You might actually remember it caused a measurable drop in global temperature, over 0.5 degrees Celsius for a whole year, and the immediate impact on people nearby, over 20 million affected. It was huge.
So is the article just treating this as, a terrible natural disaster? Okay. Or is there a deeper interpretation?
That's the key point it makes, really. It frames Pinatubo as something more significant, like a reminder from the Earth itself.
A reminder of what?
That real fundamental power isn't always with governments or armies. It lies deep underground, In that moment, nature wasn't just the scenery for human drama. It kind of stormed onto the stage as the main character, asserting its own force.
And there was a very direct, almost immediate geopolitical consequence highlighted in the article, wasn't there? Something human politics hadn't achieved.
Yes, that's where it's really interesting. The eruption, the ashfall, it was so severe, so disruptive, it basically forced the U.S. military to abandon Clark Air Base.
Which was a massive base for them in Asia.
One of their largest, yeah. So nature, without taking sides, without any diplomacy, just erupted and achieved something decades of negotiations hadn't. The article presents it as this stark symbol of, the limits of human power against the planet.
Okay, so from that raw natural power, the article shifts focus to something much quieter, more symbolic happening in Berlin.
That's right. Also in June 1991, but very different feel. The eternal flame at the Neue Wasch Memorial in Berlin, it was quietly extinguished.
And this flame, it wasn't just any flame. It had a very specific meaning tied to the Cold War era.
It absolutely did. The source explains it burned all through the East German period. It was explicitly meant to symbolize the immortal Soviet spirit, that whole ideal of state power and endurance.
And what replaced it? It wasn't just left empty, was it?
No, it was replaced by a sculpture. Kate Halevitz's sculpture, Mother with her dead son.
Wow, okay, that is a huge shift in what's being commemorated. From this sort of abstract national ideal.
Yeah, the immortal spirit.
To incredibly personal human grief.
Exactly. And the article interprets this as a really fundamental transformation. The memorial's focus just completely pivoted from celebrating that abstract strength and ideology to acknowledging real, tangible human pain and loss. The source actually calls it a shift from an idealistic flame to a humanistic flame.
That's powerful phrasing. And this wasn't happening in isolation, was it? The article links it to the bigger picture across Eastern Europe at that moment.
Oh, absolutely. As this quiet change was happening in Berlin, the whole Soviet system was, visibly crumbling. Republics were declaring independence one after another.
Right.
You had people queuing for bread in Moscow, leaders arguing frantically about reforms. The source really emphasizes how the Soviet system claimed to uphold fairness, collective strength, was just shattered by the reality it had created.
So putting out that flame wasn't just like redecorating the memorial.
Not at all. The article stresses it was a deliberate statement. It signaled, look, we're not going to just erase the past, but we're definitely not going to blindly celebrate that version of it anymore. It marked a symbolic closing of the books on that specific state-driven ideology.
Okay, so we've had nature's assertion of power and this symbolic shift away from an old ideology. The third key moment the article points to. This one's about nationhood, isn't it?
Yes, the birth of a new nation, or at least its declaration. Just 10 days after Pinatubo erupted, so June 25th, 1991, Croatia declared its independence from the Yugoslav Federation.
And Yugoslavia itself. The article paints it as this place that maybe seems like a softer socialism alternative for a while, but by 91 it was tearing itself apart.
Completely collapsing. The pressures, the ethnic hatreds that had been simmering, they just exploded. And Croatia's move wasn't the end of it. Slovenia declared independence around the same time, then Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo. The whole federation was unraveling.
But Croatia's declaration specifically had immediate, terrible consequences.
Yeah, the article is very direct about this. It says, this declaration was basically the starting gun for the brutal Balkan conflicts that defined much of the 1990s.
And the human cost described. It's just staggering.
It really is. The source cites figures like over 20,000 people killed, hundreds of thousands displaced, entire cities like Vukovar just destroyed. It doesn't downplay the immense suffering involved at all.
How does the source interpret this moment for Croatia then, given that terrible cost?
It captures that tension. It says, for Croatia, this desire for independence, this fire of independence, was sacred, fundamental to their identity. But pursuing it brought the literal fire of bullets.
A tragic link.
Exactly. But critically, the article also emphasizes that from that violence, from the smoke and fire, a new nation was forged. It wasn't just chaos, it was also interpreted as this powerful affirmation of a nation's right to define itself, to pursue its own identity, even if the price was devastatingly high.
So the article pulls these three threads together, the volcano, the flame, the new nation. How does it synthesize them to argue for that quiet shift in 1991?
It presents them as sort of three different facets of the same underlying transformation happening all at once. Pinatubo physically destroyed symbols of old power, like the U.S. base, forcing a recognition of nature's limits.
Right.
Berlin symbolically extinguished an old ideology, telling the world it was time to move past those grand state-centric narratives. And Croatia's declaration kicked off this new era of nations emerging from the wreckage of the Cold War blocs, fiercely asserting their own identities.
So it positions 1991 in the bigger historical context. If the 20th century was dominated by the superpowers.
The 1991, according to this source, was like the last chapter of that story, but also the very first page of the next one. A world that was clearly becoming more fragmented, definitely multipolar, and, well, a lot more complex.
And the article suggests the very idea of power was changing too.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about tanks and missiles anymore, though obviously those still mattered. The source argues that power started flowing just as much from things like collective memory, cultural heritage.
And the ability to tell your own story.
Crucially, yes. The ability for a nation to articulate and project its own identity onto the world stage. These new or re-emerging nations, they didn't just need armies. They needed symbols, they needed identity, they needed their narratives to be heard and recognized.
Which brings us back to the article's main point about that quiet shift.
Yeah, it concludes that history doesn't only remember the really noisy moments, the days of rebellion with battles and revolutions, it also remembers these quieter, perhaps more subtle days of redirection, like June 15th, 1991.
Because nothing officially world-changing happened on that single date. No major treaty signed, no big summit.
Exactly. On the surface, it might have seemed like just another day globally, but the article's argument is that beneath the surface, in that quietness, an old world order was dissolving.
And a new one was starting to take shape.
A new world, yeah. Maybe more uncertain, definitely messy, but also filled with these new possibilities, new voices demanding to be heard.
So the article really leaves you thinking that history isn't just written in grand pronouncements or battlefield victories.
Right. It suggests history can be written by, a cloud of volcanic dust circling the planet, or a statue being changed in a memorial square, or just a formal declaration by a nation claiming its place.
That's why it ends with that provocative thought, calling 1991 not just an end, but maybe the first fire of the 21st century.
Yeah, igniting something new.
It is fascinating how the source weaves these things together. Nature's power, shifting symbols, national identity, to paint 1991 as this pivotal, if maybe underestimated, turning point away from the old superpower dynamic.
It definitely makes you think differently about how historical change happens, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you wonder, how good are we, really, at spotting those quieter turning points as they happen, compared to the ones that make all the headlines?
That's a great question.
Or maybe think about today, how much do things like symbols, national stories, collective memory still shape global events, perhaps just as much as economics or military strength? What really resonates with you looking back at these moments from 91 through this lens?
Well, it's that idea of underlying currents, I suppose. How things we might dismiss individually, an eruption, a statue, a declaration, can collectively signal a massive sea change that maybe we only fully appreciate in hindsight. These subtle shifts really did reshape the world we live in now.
A lot to think about there. Thanks for diving into this source with us today.
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more history daily.